Miss Marple and the Case of the Empty Suitcase. Chapter 1. The Arrival at Rosehill Station. The morning express from London slowed as it curved into Rosehill Station, letting out a soft hiss of steam that drifted across the platform like early mist. It was a mild April day, the sort that promised spring without quite delivering it. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and coal smoke, and a blackbird sang somewhere near the ticket office. Among the handful of passengers who stepped down from the train was Mrs. Clarissa Dane, a woman in her mid-40s with a determined face and a fur collar that seemed too grand for so small a village. She paused, scanning the quiet platform as if expecting someone to meet her. No one did. The porter, a lean man with a cap pulled low over his brow, offered to take her case. "Just this one, he asked, reaching for the modest brown suitcase at her feet. "Yes, thank you," Clarissa replied, distracted. "It's lighter than it looks." The porter grunted in reply. He found that strange. The case felt oddly light, almost empty. But he shrugged. It wasn't his place to wonder about such things. He loaded it onto the cart and pushed it down the platform, whistling softly to himself. From the other end of the platform, Miss Jane Marple stood with her gloved hands neatly folded around her umbrella. She had come to collect a small parcel from London, a special kind of knitting wool sent by her niece. But as was often the case, her bright blue eyes took in far more than the reason for her errand. She noticed Mrs. Dane immediately. A stranger in Rosehill always drew attention, but Miss Marple had a particular interest in how newcomers behaved. The woman's anxious glances and the way she clutched her handbag told a story. People who were at ease seldom watched train doors as if expecting ghosts to step out of them. "New arrival?" asked Mr. Tom Ridley, the stationmaster, tipping his hat as he approached Miss Marple. "Came in on the 10:40. From London, I reckon." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Indeed. She seems rather flustered. Perhaps she's come to stay at the inn." "Could be," said Ridley. "Though Mrs. Dane, if I caught the name right from her label, doesn't look like one for the local inn. More like a lady visiting for business." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Business in Rosehill was usually limited to farming, parish meetings, or the annual flower show. Women like Mrs. Dane did not often come for such things. That afternoon, the little village stirred with talk. The arrival of a well-dressed stranger was the sort of event that filled teacup chatter. At the Rosehill tea rooms, two ladies, Mrs. Pennington and Miss Claire Havers, discussed it over scones. "I saw her myself," Mrs. Pennington announced. "Quite refined. Though between you and me, she looked troubled." "Troubled?" Miss Havers leaned forward eagerly, positively pale. "And she asked Mr. Ridley for directions to the old coach house. You know who lives there now, that peculiar man, Mr. Ambrose Vale." Miss Havers' eyes widened. "The writer?" "The very one. Though I hear he's fallen on hard times. Some say he drinks. Others say," she paused dramatically, "he's mixed up in something worse." At that moment, Miss Marple entered the tea room, greeting them with her usual gentle warmth. She took her tea quietly in the corner, but she could not help overhearing. Years of living in St. Mary Mead had taught her that gossip, when properly sifted, often contained the grains of truth that led to much larger revelations. She stirred her tea thoughtfully. An elegant stranger, a visit to a reclusive writer, and an empty-looking suitcase. It might mean nothing, of course. Most things in life didn't. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that tragedy often began in the most ordinary of settings. The next morning, Rosehill woke to shocking news. Mrs. Clarissa Dane was dead. Her body had been discovered in her room at the old coach house, seated by the fireplace as if she had simply fallen asleep. But there was no fire burning, and the open suitcase beside her was, as the constable reported, completely empty. Nothing stolen. No signs of struggle. No clue as to what she had brought or taken away. And by mid-morning, the whole village was whispering. "Poor woman," said Mrs. Pennington. "A heart attack, they say. Though I can't help wondering why a healthy woman from London would die so suddenly." Miss Marple, standing by the post office window, watched the village policeman hurry by. She sighed softly, the faintest shadow crossing her calm features. "People rarely die," she murmured, "at the exact moment most convenient to others." Chapter 2. The Gossip Begins. By the time the church clock struck 11, the entire village of Rosehill knew that Mrs. Clarissa Dane, the lady from London with the fine fur collar, had been found dead in her room at the old coach house. News travelled fast in Rosehill, faster still when it involved mystery. At the Rose and Crown, the only inn in the village, the usual morning talk of gardens and weather was entirely forgotten. Cups rattled against saucers, heads leaned close, and voices dropped to excited whispers. "Dead!" exclaimed Mrs. Turner, the innkeeper's wife, to anyone who would listen. "She was here not 2 days. Mr. Vale says he found her himself, sitting by the hearth as calm as you please." "Poisoned?" asked Mr. Jarvis, who delivered milk to half the cottages in Rosehill. Mrs. Turner shook her head importantly. "The constable says no sign of foul play. But I tell you this, something's not right about that suitcase of hers." "What about it?" "Empty." Mrs. Turner hissed. "Completely empty. Not a thing inside but a torn bit of ribbon. What woman travels from London with an empty suitcase?" The question hung in the air like a chill breeze. No one had an answer. That same morning, Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden, knitting needles flashing in the sunlight while Reverend Chisholm's wife, a kindly but excitable woman, poured out the latest tidings with the air of one performing a sacred duty. "My dear Miss Marple, it's the most dreadful business. Poor Mrs. Dane. They say she arrived looking anxious, kept her door locked, and asked for breakfast to be left outside. And then, this morning, gone. Just like that." Miss Marple nodded gently, though her eyes remained thoughtful rather than shocked. "And no one heard anything in the night?" "Nothing at all. Mr. Vale told Constable Sims he was out walking past midnight, something about insomnia, and when he returned, her lamp was still lit. Oh, I dare say the poor man's beside himself." "Walking alone?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Yes. Though he's a peculiar sort, Mr. Vale. Lives mostly by himself, writing those dreadful books no one reads." Mrs. Chisholm leaned closer. "They say he once had some scandal in London. A woman, perhaps. You know how such things go." Miss Marple did indeed know. Scandals, she thought, were rarely as they appeared, often less sinful, but far more interesting. Meanwhile, Constable Sims, a large, red-faced man unused to anything more serious than the occasional lost bicycle, had his hands full. He stood in the narrow lane leading to the old coach-house, notebook in hand, trying to appear efficient. Mr. Ambrose Vale, tall and dishevelled, was pacing the garden path, cigarette trembling slightly in his fingers. "I tell you, officer," he said, "she seemed frightened, that's the only word for it. Frightened of something or someone. When she arrived, she asked if there was a back entrance she could use. I thought it odd, but, well, she paid in advance." Sims scratched his head. "And you didn't ask what she was afraid of?" Vale gave a humorless laugh. "Good heavens, man, I'm not in the habit of cross-examining my guests. I let her alone." Miss Marple, who happened to be passing along the lane just then, purely by chance, of course, paused politely. "Such a tragedy," she said. "If I may, Constable, might I ask, was there anything found in her room? Letters, perhaps?" The constable looked uncertain. "Nothing of note, Miss Marple. A handbag, half a cup of tea, and that blasted empty suitcase. The doctor thinks it might have been her heart." "Possibly," Miss Marple said softly. "Though it's curious, one rarely travels with an empty case unless one intends to fill it." Both men looked at her, puzzled. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, it's merely that I once knew a woman who did just that. Brought an empty suitcase to a cousin's house so she could take something away without anyone noticing." Mr. Vale dropped his cigarette. "Take something away? But what?" Miss Marple gave him a kind, vague smile. "Ah, I dare say we shall find out soon enough." By evening, Rosehill's quiet lanes buzzed like a hive. Some said Mrs. Dane was a spy. Others swore she had come to meet a secret lover. And through it all, Miss Marple listened, quietly, carefully, knitting her steady rows as gossip flowed around her. She had already noted several small details. The torn ribbon in the suitcase. The late-night walk of Mr. Vale. The way Mrs. Dane had asked for privacy. Each, on its own, meant little. But together, they formed a pattern, faint, like stitches just beginning to show on the back of a tapestry. When the church bells tolled 9, Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked toward the dark windows of the old coach-house. "People," she murmured to herself, "are seldom what they seem. And neither, I think, are suitcases." Chapter 3. The First Clues. The following morning dawned pale and damp, with a fine drizzle drifting over the rooftops of Rosehill. The cobblestones glistened, and the air carried that faint, clean scent that comes after rain. Life in the village seemed to continue as usual. The baker opened his shop, milk bottles clinked on doorsteps, yet beneath it all, a quiet unease lingered. At the old coach house, Constable Sims stood guard outside the gate, his expression grim but uncertain. Inside, the small parlour where Mrs. Clarissa Dane had spent her final hours still held a faint trace of lavender scent, and something else Miss Marple noticed immediately, the unnatural stillness of a room whose story had not yet been told. "Good morning, Constable," she said mildly, stepping through the doorway with her neat umbrella and calm composure. "I thought I might bring some tea for you. These long mornings are quite dreadful for one's constitution." Sims, flustered but grateful, accepted the cup. "Thank you kindly, Miss Marple. The doctor says it was her heart, plain and simple." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, glancing around the room. "Such things often seem simple, until one looks too closely." She moved slowly, almost absently, as if admiring the furniture. But her eyes missed nothing. The fire grate was clean, too clean for a house that should have had embers from the night before. The teacup on the side table had a pale ring of lipstick, but no trace of sugar crystals, though a spoon lay nearby. The window was unlatched, and a fine mist of rain had dampened the sill. Most curious of all was the suitcase. It rested open on the small bed, lined in faded blue silk, utterly empty save for a torn strip of rose-colored ribbon. "May I?" Miss Marple asked politely, already lifting the edge of the ribbon with her gloved fingers. "Nothing in it," Sims said. "Not a thing. She brought it from London," the porter said. "Couldn't have weighed more than a feather." Miss Marple turned the ribbon thoughtfully. "You know, Constable, I once had a friend who used to tie ribbons to the handles of her luggage, so she could tell them apart. Quite clever, really. Only this one looks torn, as if cut, rather than worn." Sims frowned. "Cut? You think someone—" "Oh, I think nothing at all," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "It's only that threads fray in a different way when torn by accident. Habit of mine to notice such things. I dare say it comes from too much mending." She bent lower, inspecting the carpet beneath the dressing table. There, half hidden under the rug, lay a tiny scrap of crumpled grey paper. Miss Marple smoothed it delicately. It appeared to be part of a telegram, the corner only, with a few blurred words visible. "Arriving tomorrow. Urgent. Do not." That was all. She folded the fragment and handed it to Constable Sims. "Perhaps the rest will turn up. Telegrams do have a habit of saying rather too much, don't they?" Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr. Ambrose Vale, who looked pale and haggard in his study. The room was cluttered with papers, books, and the lingering odour of tobacco. "I can't think how it happened," he said, pacing. "One moment she was alive, nervous, yes, but alive, and the next morning she was gone. The doctor insists it was natural, yet, well, it doesn't sit right." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "You were kind to offer her a room. Did she mention anyone she expected to meet here in Rosehill?" Vale hesitated. "Only once. She said she was waiting for someone, an old acquaintance. She wouldn't give a name." "Curious," said Miss Marple softly. "And did she send or receive any messages during her stay?" He thought for a moment. "A telegram came for her yesterday morning. She seemed startled when she read it, and asked for a pen. Then she tore it up and threw it into the fire. I suppose she didn't wish anyone to see it." Miss Marple's eyes flickered toward the grate. "Ah, fireplaces are rather unreliable places for secrets, don't you think? Ashes do cling most persistently." Vale frowned, following her gaze. "You believe she was in danger?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that she believed she was." When Miss Marple left the old coach house, the rain had stopped, and the evening sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long golden light across the hedgerows. She paused by the gate, turning back for one last look at the quiet house. There was something about it, a sense of waiting. She thought again of the torn ribbon, the missing contents of the suitcase, and the half-burned telegram. And in her mind, faintly, the outline of a pattern began to take shape. "People often imagine," she murmured to herself, "that what is missing tells them nothing. But very often, the absence of something is the loudest clue of all." Chapter 4. The Wrong Suspect. By the next day, Rosehill was practically humming with rumour. The inquest had not yet been announced, but that didn't stop every shopkeeper, gardener, and postmistress from holding their own. And as gossip does in every English village worth its church spire, it soon found a convenient villain. That villain, at least for the moment, was Mr. Ambrose Vale. "He's the only one who saw her last," Mrs. Turner whispered to her husband across the counter of the Rose and Crown. "And you remember what they said about him in London, that dreadful business with his publisher's wife. A man capable of such things is capable of anything." Mr. Turner, polishing a glass, nodded sagely. "And he walks about at all hours of the night. That's not natural." By midday, the constable had heard enough to justify making inquiries, which in Rosehill meant knocking politely and looking uncomfortable. When Constable Sims arrived at the old coach-house that afternoon, Mr. Vale was seated at his desk, a fresh manuscript before him but his pen idle. He looked up with visible weariness. "Again, Constable." "Just routine, sir," Sims said, notebook at the ready. "There's been talk. Folk say you and the deceased had words." "Words?" Vale repeated sharply. "She was my guest, not my enemy." Miss Marple, who happened to be passing the garden gate, and who never passed such scenes without noticing a thing or two, paused just long enough to overhear the tone, indignation mixed with genuine hurt. She continued up the lane, only to reappear 10 minutes later with a basket of scones and an innocent smile. "I thought, Constable, you and Mr. Vale might like a little refreshment. Investigations are so much better conducted with tea." Sims blinked. "Well, thank you, Miss Marple. Very kind of you." "Not at all. I find people are always more forthcoming when they have something warm to hold." She poured the tea herself, neatly setting cups before both men. The questioning resumed, but under Miss Marple's serene presence, it softened. "You'd no quarrel with Mrs. Dane, then?" asked Sims. "None whatsoever," Vale replied. "She was, well, secretive, but polite. Nervous, perhaps. I thought she might be escaping someone." "Escaping?" Miss Marple repeated gently, her eyes bright with quiet curiosity. "Yes." She kept glancing out the window as if she expected to see someone in the lane. "The last thing she said to me was, 'It'll be over soon.' I assumed she meant some domestic trouble. Heaven knows we all have those." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "And you didn't ask what she meant?" He gave a bitter smile. "It's not my habit to pry, Miss Marple." "Ah," she said softly, "but sometimes a little prying can save one from very unpleasant surprises." When Constable Sims left, quite convinced he'd done his duty, Miss Marple remained a few minutes longer. "I do hope you won't let this talk upset you, Mr. Vale," she said kindly. "Village tongues wag most dreadfully when they're bored. It's the lack of excitement. You see, murders are so very stimulating." Vale gave a hollow laugh. "It's a grim kind of stimulation, Miss Marple." "True," she admitted. "But one learns much from it. For instance, I've always noticed that guilt talks too much, while innocence grows quiet. You, I think, are the latter." He looked at her, uncertain. "You believe I'm innocent?" "Oh, I believe very little, Mr. Vale," she said, rising. "But I observe a great deal. And I've yet to meet a murderer who offers tea to the constable." Her eyes twinkled as she left him standing there, half amused, half bewildered. Outside, Miss Marple paused by the garden gate, gazing toward the hedgerow that bordered the path. Something glinted faintly among the nettles, a scrap of paper, or perhaps fabric. She stooped, lifted it carefully, and found a small luggage tag, its string frayed and half broken. The writing on it was nearly smudged away, but one could still make out the faint impression of 3 words. M.V. London Express. Miss Marple's brow furrowed ever so slightly. The initials, of course, were Ambrose Vale's, yet he had not left the village in months. She slipped the tag neatly into her handbag. "A curious thing," she murmured. "An empty suitcase and a full imagination, and both belong to the wrong person." That evening, the sun sank behind the church steeple, casting long amber shadows across Rosehill. The villagers locked their doors early, whispering about poison, quarrels, and London scandals. But in her cosy sitting room, Miss Marple sat quietly by the lamp, knitting in slow, deliberate rhythm. Every so often, she paused, her eyes distant, her mind piecing together the faint, unseen threads that tied Mrs. Dane, Mr. Vale, and that mysterious suitcase together. "Poor Mr. Vale," she said softly. "He's not the sort to kill. But someone has been clever enough to make it look as though he might." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that usually meant someone, somewhere, was about to be very neatly caught out. Chapter 5. Secrets Revealed. For the next 2 days, Rosehill tried to return to normal. But normality, once broken, is not easily restored. Every church bell seemed a little louder, every whisper a little sharper. The death of Mrs. Clarissa Dane had become a thread running through every conversation, every polite smile, every tray of scones shared over afternoon tea. Even the postmistress, Mrs. Webb, a woman of strict morals and stronger opinions, found herself lingering over the telegram records with just a touch more curiosity than usual. Miss Marple, who happened to step into the post office that morning for a new book of stamps, noticed the flutter of excitement in Mrs. Webb's expression before the woman even spoke. "Oh, Miss Marple. You've heard, of course." Mrs. Webb began, her voice trembling with restrained eagerness. "I've had to inform the constable, though it seems he already knew. A telegram came for Mrs. Dane the day before her death." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes, I heard mention of that. It must have been quite urgent." Indeed it was. Marked urgent and paid from London, but here's the curious thing. Mrs. Webb leaned forward confidentially. It wasn't sent from her address. It was sent to her, from a man's name. A Mr. Martin Vale. Miss Marple's knitting bag slipped slightly from her arm. "Martin Vale," she repeated, her tone mild, but her mind already racing. "How very coincidental." "Coincidental indeed," said Mrs. Webb with relish. "And you know who else goes by the name of Vale? That writer, Ambrose Vale. Now, I'm not one to gossip, but—" "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Everyone in Rosehill gossips. It's practically a form of public service." Mrs. Webb laughed, but Miss Marple's thoughts had already moved on. 2 Vales, Ambrose and Martin. Brothers, perhaps. Or cousins. Or merely a chance of shared surname. But Miss Marple did not believe much in coincidence. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Ambrose Vale once more, carrying her knitting basket as usual, a harmless pretext that had served her well for years. He looked startled to see her. "Miss Marple, twice in 2 days. Have you come to question me again?" "Not at all," she replied sweetly. "I simply came to return your book. Quite dreadful, I must say, too much cynicism and not enough tea." He almost smiled despite himself. "That's the trouble with my novels. No one believes in ordinary decency anymore." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple softly, "I believe in it most firmly. But decency, Mr. Vale, is sometimes used as a disguise, rather like false hair or borrowed luggage." Vale frowned. "Borrowed luggage?" "Oh yes. I was told Mrs. Dane's suitcase bore your initials, M.V. Curious, isn't it? Unless, of course, it wasn't hers at all." His eyes widened. "My initials? That's absurd. I've never lent a suitcase to anyone." He paused, then his brow furrowed. "Wait. Martin Vale, my brother, could that be what you mean? He travels for business, owns several pieces of luggage marked with his initials. I haven't seen him in years." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, though her smile remained as gentle as ever. "And where is your brother now?" "I've no idea," Vale said with sudden unease. "We quarrelled over money, mostly. He was always the ambitious one. Last I heard, he was working for a shipping firm in London." "Shipping," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Such an interesting business. So many comings and goings. I wonder if Mrs. Dane might have been expecting him." Vale stared at her. "You think my brother knew her?" "I think," Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting, "that Mrs. Dane came to Rosehill expecting to meet a man, and that man's name began with the same 2 letters that appeared on her suitcase." That evening, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Chisholm, the vicar's wife, for tea beside the fire. The rain had returned, tapping softly against the window panes. "It's too dreadful, Jane," Mrs. Chisholm sighed. "Poor Mrs. Dane, and now this business about the Vales. Do you think it's true they're related?" "Oh yes," said Miss Marple. "I believe it's true enough. But relationships can be complicated things. You know, I once knew a family who quarreled so bitterly that one brother stole the other's passport, and his name along with it. Caused no end of confusion when the police came asking questions. Mrs. Chisholm gasped. Surely not. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, people do the strangest things when money is involved, or guilt. She set down her teacup, her eyes thoughtful. If Mrs. Dane came here expecting Martin Vale and found only Ambrose instead, well, it might explain her distress, and perhaps even her death. You mean she was killed? Mrs. Chisholm whispered. I mean, Miss Marple said quietly, that some people die by another's hand, and some by another's fear. And fear, my dear, can be just as deadly. Later that night, as the village slept, Miss Marple sat by lamplight, her knitting forgotten. In front of her lay the torn telegram fragment she had found, arriving tomorrow. Do not. And the name now supplied by Mrs. Webb. To Mrs. Clarissa Dane. From Martin Vale, London. She unfolded a piece of paper and wrote 3 small notes in her delicate handwriting. The empty suitcase, with Vale initials. The telegram, from Martin Vale. The dead woman, frightened, secretive, expecting someone. Then she added one more line, underlined twice. Ambrose Vale is not the man she feared. She sat back, listening to the clock tick softly on the mantelpiece. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed, long, lonely, fading into the dark. Miss Marple smiled slightly, her eyes half closed. Yes, she murmured. I believe the next clue will arrive on the... Chapter 6, The Twist. The next morning dawned with a crisp chill that hinted at the lingering grip of early spring. Mist drifted through the hedgerows, clinging to the bare branches and curling around the church spire like pale smoke. At Rosehill Station, the 9:15 train arrived with its usual hiss of steam, but this time there was a new passenger stepping down onto the platform. He was a tall man in his mid-30s, dressed in a dark travelling coat and carrying a small leather case. His features were sharp, his eyes alert, and his manner brisk in that distinctly metropolitan way that always seemed out of place in Rosehill's gentle pace. He paused to glance around, then approached Mr. Ridley, the station master. I'm looking for the old coach house, he said curtly. Is it within walking distance? Mr. Ridley studied him with curiosity. You'd be Mr. Vale, I suppose. The man's eyes flicked sharply toward him. Why do you say that? Well, Ridley said, puffing out his chest, we don't get many new faces around here, and word travels fast. There's been a bit of excitement, you might say. The stranger's expression hardened. I'm aware of it. I'm here because of it. He walked off down the lane, boots striking firmly against the cobbles. From across the road, Miss Marple, carrying her marketing basket and appearing quite by coincidence, as usual, watched him go with polite interest. She noted the confident stride, the crispness of his speech, the faint trace of London in his voice, and something else, something brittle in the way his eyes darted over the landscape as though measuring it for exits. Martin Vale, she murmured under her breath. Just in time for the second act. By noon, the entire village knew that Mr. Martin Vale, brother of Ambrose, had arrived, and that his first destination had been the old coach house, where he had locked himself in his late brother's study for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he was pale and agitated. Constable Sims, ever diligent in appearing busy, had been nearby and saw enough to start another flurry of whispers. He asked after the suitcase. Sims told Mrs. Turner in a low voice that was anything but private. Wanted to see it. I told him the inspector took it to town for evidence. You'd have thought I told him the house was on fire, the way he reacted. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited both brothers to tea, an act of innocent hospitality that caused half the village to stop pretending not to watch. Ambrose came first, looking wary but resigned. Martin arrived precisely on time, removing his hat with a stiff nod. The contrast between them was striking. Ambrose, all untidy melancholy and nervous charm. Martin, sleek, confident, with the faintest whiff of arrogance. Such a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Vale, Miss Marple said, ushering him to the sitting room. You must be tired from your journey. Rosehill can feel rather slow after London's pace. Quite, Martin replied shortly. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the small plate of seed cake. My brother tells me you've taken quite an interest in Mrs. Dane's death. Oh, merely a neighbour's curiosity, said Miss Marple pleasantly. I dislike puzzles left unsolved. They do so spoil one's knitting rhythm. Ambrose gave a strained smile. Martin did not. She was an acquaintance of mine, Martin said after a pause. A former employee, one might say. She'd been assisting me with some confidential business records. When she failed to return to London, I naturally came to see what happened. How conscientious of you, Miss Marple said mildly. Though it seems curious that she came all the way to Rosehill without informing you of her intentions, and that she carried a suitcase marked with your initials. Martin's gaze sharpened. She must have borrowed it without my knowledge. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Borrowed, yes. Or perhaps she wanted the world to think she had. A woman in fear sometimes uses another's name as a shield. Martin frowned. I don't understand. Oh, I think you do, said Miss Marple softly. Mrs. Dane was frightened of something or someone. She brought your suitcase because she wanted it to appear as though she were traveling under your protection. A clever ruse, unless, of course, she had reason to fear you. Ambrose rose half from his chair. Miss Marple. But she only smiled gently, lifting her hand. Oh, I make no accusations. I merely observe. And what I've observed is that Mrs. Dane's death came at a most convenient moment, just before she might have spoken to someone. To whom? Martin asked sharply. Miss Marple's eyes met his, calm and steady. Perhaps to the police. Or perhaps to the man she thought she could trust. I wonder, Mr. Vale, did you expect her to arrive with something in that suitcase? Something valuable. For the first time, Martin's composure slipped. His jaw tightened. That's absurd. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, I dare say it is. But absurdities, in my experience, often hide the truth most effectively. After the brothers left, the cosy parlour seemed unusually quiet. Miss Marple sat still for several minutes, her knitting untouched, her expression thoughtful. Then she opened her notebook and added a single new line beneath her previous notes. The suitcase was not empty when she left London. She tapped her pen lightly. Now, she murmured, the question is, what was taken, and by whom? Outside, the mist had thickened again, wrapping the village in soft grey silence. Somewhere in that silence, Miss Marple felt, the next clue was already waiting to be found. And as the evening train whistled faintly in the distance, she smiled to herself. The trouble with secrets, she said softly, is that they always travel faster than their owners. Chapter 7. The Hidden Past. That evening, Rosehill seemed quieter than usual. The streets were damp from a light drizzle, and the gas lamps threw soft halos across the cobblestones. Most villagers were indoors, discussing in hushed tones the arrival of Mr. Martin Vale, for no stranger had ever stirred so much interest in so short a time. At the old coach-house, however, lights still glowed in the study long after the others had gone dark. Inside, Ambrose Vale sat before the fire, nursing a cup of brandy, his thoughts heavy and restless. He hadn't spoken much since tea with Miss Marple, and his brother's sudden appearance had unsettled him deeply. For years, they had lived separate lives. Ambrose, the quiet recluse, content with village life. Martin, the ambitious businessman, always one step ahead in London. And yet now, here they were, brought together by the death of a woman neither had wished to see again. A visitor at dusk. A soft knock came at the door. Ambrose frowned, set down his glass, and went to open it. Standing there, wrapped in a shawl against the rain, was Miss Marple herself. I do hope I'm not intruding, she said gently. I was passing and noticed your light. Such a rare thing to see at this hour. Not at all, Miss Marple, Ambrose replied, a little embarrassed. Do come in. She stepped inside, glancing briefly at the mantelpiece where a faded photograph stood, a woman with sharp eyes and a knowing smile. Your late mother, I believe. Yes, Ambrose said quietly. She adored this house. Ah, said Miss Marple, with that mild tone that so often concealed her sharpest observations. She looks as though she saw quite a lot. Mothers usually do. Ambrose smiled faintly. She saw too much, perhaps, especially where Martin was concerned. Miss Marple took a seat by the fire, her eyes never leaving his face. I imagine she worried about him. Ambition can be a dangerous friend. He hesitated. You could say that. Martin was always chasing something: money, reputation, success. He made a name for himself in London. Property deals, business ventures, all very grand. "And Mrs. Dane?" asked Miss Marple softly. The question hung in the air. The fire cracked. Ambrose looked away. She worked for him once, as his secretary. But there was more. Something between them. Affection. A bitter laugh. Hardly. She was clever enough to know how to keep him interested. And she had something he needed. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Information. Ambrose nodded. A set of documents. Contracts, letters. Something to do with an investment scheme that went wrong. Martin told me he'd been swindled, but I never quite believed him. He always had a way of twisting things to suit himself. And Mrs. Dane kept copies. I think so. She hinted as much when she visited me last month. Miss Marple blinked. She came here before. Yes. Said she wanted peace and quiet, and that she trusted me more than anyone else. She seemed frightened, Miss Marple. Terribly frightened. She said if anything happened to her, the truth would come out, and that I should look inside the case. "The empty suitcase," murmured Miss Marple. Ambrose nodded slowly. Yes. But it wasn't empty when she arrived. I saw her unpacking in the guest room. There were papers, dozens of them, tied with a blue ribbon. The next morning, they were gone. She told me she had sent them somewhere safe. I didn't press her. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly, though her tone remained calm. "And you didn't mention this to Inspector Graves?" Ambrose shook his head. I was afraid it would drag Martin into it. And his family, after all. A trail of shadows. Miss Marple rose and walked to the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the garden glistening in moonlight. "Mrs. Dane trusted you," she said quietly. "That much is clear. But she also feared that the truth, whatever it was, might be destroyed if left in the wrong hands. So she sent it away. The question is, to whom?" Ambrose frowned. "You think someone else in the village has those papers?" "Oh, quite possibly," Miss Marple said. "Rosehill may seem simple, but every household here has its little secrets. And Mrs. Dane was a woman who noticed things. She would not have chosen a hiding place without purpose." She turned back to him. "Did she speak with anyone else during her stay?" Ambrose thought for a moment. "She went into the village several times. I know she called on Mrs. Turner once, something about a parcel. And she spoke with the vicar, I think." "Mrs. Turner," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, I imagine she might know something about parcels." Ambrose hesitated, then said quietly, "Miss Marple, do you think Martin had anything to do with her death?" Miss Marple gave him a long, steady look. "I think your brother has a great deal to lose if certain papers were ever found. But whether that makes him a murderer, well, that remains to be seen." A village by night. Later, as Miss Marple walked home along the damp lane, the village seemed almost to hold its breath. The cottages slept, the wind sighed through the hedges, and far off, the church clock chimed 11. Miss Marple walked slowly, thinking. A woman in fear. A suitcase that wasn't empty. Documents that vanished overnight. And a brother who arrived too quickly after murder. She smiled faintly to herself, the expression that so often puzzled those who underestimated her. "When one cannot find the key," she murmured, "it is often because one is looking at the wrong lock." And with that quiet remark, she stepped into her garden gate, the sound of rain beginning again, gentle, persistent, like a whisper of secrets yet to be told. Chapter 8. The Parcel at the Post Office. The following morning dawned pale and damp, the kind of English morning that seemed perpetually undecided between drizzle and sunshine. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and coal smoke, and the cobblestones of Rosehill High Street gleamed under a thin film of rain. Miss Marple, wrapped in a sensible tweed coat and carrying her market basket, walked briskly toward the post office and general store, where Mrs. Turner was already arranging tins and packets behind the counter with her usual combination of pride and gossip. "Good morning, Mrs. Turner," Miss Marple greeted, her voice cheerful. "A dreadful morning for rheumatism, I fear." "Oh, indeed it is, Miss Marple," Mrs. Turner said, setting down a tin of treacle with a sigh. "My husband says the damp gets into his bones. Of course, he's done no real work since 1937, so I dare say that doesn't help." Miss Marple smiled sympathetically. Men do find such comfort in their ailments. A little attention goes a long way. Mrs. Turner chuckled. "That's true enough. Now, what can I do for you today? Tea, sugar, or a bit of news?" "Oh, perhaps a little of each," Miss Marple said mildly. "I was wondering, I heard that poor Mrs. Dane called here not long before her death. Something about a parcel." Mrs. Turner froze for the briefest moment, just long enough for Miss Marple to notice. "Oh, well, yes," she said quickly, "she did. It wasn't anything of interest, really. Just a small package. I remember because she seemed so particular about it being sent that very day." "How curious," Miss Marple said. "Did she happen to say where it was going?" Mrs. Turner hesitated, lowering her voice. "Well, it's not really proper for me to tell." Miss Marple leaned in, her eyes twinkling. "My dear Mrs. Turner, you and I have both lived long enough to know that propriety is a flexible concept, especially where the police are concerned. Inspector Graves would surely wish the truth to be known, wouldn't he?" Mrs. Turner sighed, defeated. It was addressed to a woman, Mrs. Elspeth Grant. Somewhere in London. Kensington, I think. But what struck me was that Mrs. Dane didn't post it herself. She handed it to young Tommy Larkin, said she trusted him to see it properly done. "Tommy Larkin," repeated Miss Marple thoughtfully. "The gardener's boy at the old coach house." "The same. Nice lad, but a bit simple. Still, he's always running errands for half the village." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you actually see him post it?" Mrs. Turner pursed her lips. "Now that you mention it, no. He came in, took the parcel, and said he'd drop it at the station post bag. But with all the commotion that morning, the police, the poor lady's death, I never thought to check. A missing parcel. Half an hour later, Miss Marple was walking through the drizzle toward the railway yard, where Tommy Larkin was sweeping puddles off the platform with more enthusiasm than skill. "Good morning, Tommy," she called. The boy looked up, grinning sheepishly. "Oh, good morning, Miss Marple. Beastly wet again, isn't it?" "Quite," she agreed kindly. "I hear you were helping Mrs. Dane the other day. Such a thoughtful thing to do." Tommy's face brightened. "Oh, yes, She gave me a shilling to take a parcel to the station post." "And did you?" He shifted uneasily. "Well, not exactly. You see, I meant to, but then Mr. Ambrose asked me to fetch something from the shed, and then I forgot to put it in the bag. By the time I remembered, it was gone." "Gone?" "Yes, I left it on the bench by the luggage scales, and when I came back it wasn't there. I thought the postman might have taken it early, but he said he hadn't." Miss Marple's brows rose ever so slightly. "And you didn't tell anyone?" Tommy looked miserable. Didn't want to get into trouble, Mrs. Dane was ever so particular about it. Miss Marple patted his arm gently. "You did what you thought best, I'm sure. But, Tommy, think carefully. Did you notice anyone else on the platform just then?" He frowned, thinking hard. "Well, yes, actually. Mr. Vale, the London one. He'd just got off the train, carrying a bag. I remember 'cause he looked cross as thunder." The clue in the ledger. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the stationmaster's office. Mr. Ridley, who never missed a chance to feel important, welcomed her warmly. "Ah, Miss Marple. Here to inspect the timetables, eh? Always said you could run this station better than I could." "I very much doubt that," Miss Marple said modestly. "But I was hoping to look at your posting ledger, just a matter of curiosity." He blinked. "Oh, something amiss?" "Not exactly. I was told Mrs. Dane's parcel might have been posted from here. It would have been about a week ago." Mr. Ridley flipped open the heavy book and traced a finger down the columns. "Let's see. Monday, 1 parcel to Bath, 1 to London, Ham. Here we are, Mrs. E. Grant, Kensington. Sent by hand, noted as received by M. Vale." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "By Mr. Martin Vale." "Seems so. Signed for it himself. Came in that same morning." "Curious indeed," Miss Marple murmured. The quiet realization. That evening, in her cozy sitting room, Miss Marple sat knitting as the fire crackled softly. Her mind, however, was far from wool and needles. Mrs. Dane had sent a parcel she believed would protect her. It never reached London. Instead, it had been intercepted by the one man she feared most. She laid down her knitting and opened her notebook once more. On a clean page, she wrote, "Parcel posted to Mrs. Grant, intercepted by M. Vale. Contents unknown. Likely papers from suitcase." Mrs. Dane's death followed within 12 hours. She closed the book and stared into the fire. The truth was beginning to take shape, a pattern faint but unmistakable. "Ah," she murmured, "so the suitcase was not the beginning, but the end." Poor Mrs. Dane, she thought she was posting safety when she was only posting her doom. The clock struck 9. Outside, the rain fell steadily once more, as if to wash away the sins of the village, though Miss Marple knew it would take more than rain to do that. Chapter 9. The Woman in Kensington. 2 mornings later, the 8:02 train from Rosehill steamed out of the station, its whistle echoing faintly over the damp fields. Inside a second-class carriage, Miss Marple sat with a neatly folded umbrella, a small handbag, and an expression of serene purpose. It was not often that she left the village, but when she did, there was always a very good reason. And today, that reason was a name: Mrs. Elspeth Grant, the mysterious recipient of Mrs. Dane's missing parcel. Miss Marple had sent a polite telegram the previous evening, requesting brief call regarding mutual acquaintance, Mrs. Dane. Sincerely, Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead. The reply had arrived within the hour. "Do come. I've been expecting someone. R.E.G." That alone was enough to quicken Miss Marple's curiosity. A house of quiet secrets. Kensington, when she arrived, was busy with the usual mid-morning traffic, hansom cabs, delivery vans, and the chatter of well-dressed women with little dogs. But number 14 Cranley Crescent was an oasis of calm. It stood discreetly back from the road, with ivy climbing its pale brick facade and lace curtains drawn against the street. A neat maid opened the door. "Miss Marple. Mrs. Grant is expecting you." Miss Marple was shown into a sitting room that spoke of restrained elegance, chintz chairs, soft lighting, and the faint smell of lavender. A woman rose from the writing desk to greet her. Mrs. Elspeth Grant was in her early 50s, graceful, with silver-streak hair and the sort of poise that comes from long years of self-control. Her eyes, however, held the unmistakable weariness of someone who has lived with too much knowledge. "How kind of you to come," she said warmly. "Please, sit down. I suppose you're here about poor Margaret Dane." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "You knew her well." "For several years. We were colleagues of a sort. She worked for Mr. Martin Vale, as I did, though I left his employ before she did." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "Then you must know something of the nature of that employment." Mrs. Grant hesitated. It was legal, on the surface. Investments, contracts, property transfers, all respectable enough. But Mr. Vale's business had layers, Miss Marple. Beneath the polite veneer, there were dealings that might not withstand daylight. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, and Mrs. Dane discovered one of those darker layers. "I believe she did. She confided in me after leaving his office. She had found documents, proof that Mr. Vale was using false identities to funnel money abroad. Fraud, blackmail, perhaps worse. She said she was terrified, but determined to make it right." "Did she ever mention a particular set of papers tied with a blue ribbon?" Mrs. Grant's eyes widened. "Yes, those very ones. She told me she'd made copies and planned to send them to me for safekeeping. But I never received them." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "They were intercepted. At Rosehill Station. By Mr. Vale himself." Mrs. Grant closed her eyes for a moment. "Then it's true. I feared as much when I read of her death in the papers." The letter that never came. Miss Marple waited patiently as Mrs. Grant composed herself, then said gently, "Forgive me, but may I ask, why would Mrs. Dane trust you above all others?" A faint smile touched the woman's lips. "Because she knew I had nothing left to lose. Mr. Vale ruined my husband years ago. Drove him into bankruptcy with false promises and deceit. I recognized his charm for what it was, poison wrapped in silver words. When Margaret confided in me, I swore I'd help her expose him." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And now she's gone." "Yes," said Mrs. Grant. "But she didn't die for nothing. If the police have those papers—" They don't, Miss Marple interrupted gently. They vanished before they reached London. And I fear the police, bless them, have been looking in entirely the wrong direction. Mrs. Grant rose and walked to the mantelpiece, where a small framed photograph stood, a young woman smiling shyly at the camera. Margaret was brave, she said quietly, but she underestimated how dangerous secrets can be when they threaten a man like Martin Vale. Miss Marple stood as well, her voice calm but firm. Then it is time those secrets came to light. A whisper from the past. Mrs. Grant turned to her. I might have something that could help. It's not much, but it might point you in the right direction. She opened a drawer in the writing desk and withdrew a small envelope, yellowed with age. I found this among some old correspondence. Margaret sent it to me months ago, before she fled London. She wrote only one line. She handed it to Miss Marple. Inside was a single folded sheet, on which was written, in a hurried hand, If I am gone, the truth lies beneath the garden. Miss Marple read the words twice, then looked up, her eyes glimmering with quiet understanding. The garden, she murmured. Of course. Do you think she meant mine? Asked Mrs. Grant. Miss Marple smiled faintly. No, my dear. I rather think she meant the old coach-house. It was, after all, her final refuge. Homeward thoughts. On the train back to Rosehill, Miss Marple sat by the window as the countryside rolled past. Green fields, stone bridges, distant woods still wet from rain. Her reflection in the glass was thoughtful, serene, but her mind was sharp and alive with connections. Mrs. Dane had fled London carrying proof of Martin Vale's crimes. She had hidden it somewhere near Ambrose's home, perhaps even in his very garden. The empty suitcase had not been empty at all, merely emptied. And now, Miss Marple realized, the truth might yet be buried there, beneath the rosebushes and ivy, waiting patiently for someone clever enough, or kind enough, to find it. She smiled softly to herself. The dead cannot speak, she murmured, but they do leave whispers for those who listen properly. Outside, the train whistle sounded, long and low, the echo of a secret returning home. Chapter 10. The Garden Beneath the Rain. The next morning broke grey and restless over Rosehill. Rain fell steadily through the dawn, pattering against window panes and dripping from the eaves in slow, persistent rhythm. The air smelled of wet earth and leaf mould, that quiet, secret scent that comes when the world is hiding something. At the old coach-house, Ambrose Vale stood by the French windows, staring out into the garden. The grass glistened like glass, and small rivulets ran between the flagstones. He had not slept well. Dreams had come, fragments of voices, the rustle of paper, and the faint echo of his brother's laughter, cold and triumphant. When the doorbell rang just after 8, he started violently. It was Miss Marple, of course, umbrella in hand, neatly gloved, her expression mild as always. Good morning, Mr. Vale. I do hope I'm not disturbing you. Such a dreadful morning, isn't it? Not at all, Miss Marple, he said automatically. Won't you come in? Only for a moment, she replied. I was hoping to ask a small favor. You see, I've taken a great interest in your garden, particularly the old rosebushes near the east wall. So charming and so very old-fashioned. Ambrose blinked. The roses. Well, you're welcome to look, of course, though I doubt you'll find much beauty there after this weather. Oh, beauty takes many forms, Miss Marple said cheerfully. Sometimes it's quite hidden beneath the surface. The garden's secret. 10 minutes later, they were outside, sheltered beneath the dripping branches. Miss Marple's umbrella tilted slightly as she surveyed the beds with practiced eyes. Such fine soil, she murmured. I always find that old gardens hold on to memories, a little like people. And this one, I think, remembers more than most. Ambrose gave a faint smile. My mother would have liked that. She used to say the garden was her confidant. How very perceptive of her, Miss Marple said softly. Tell me, was that rosebed near the wall here during her time? No, he said. We planted that after she passed. About 5 years ago. It was an empty patch before, just bare ground. Hem, Miss Marple said, crouching down with surprising agility for her age. She prodded the earth gently with her umbrella tip. Curious. The soil here looks disturbed, not recently, but not as settled as the others. Ambrose frowned. You think something's been buried there? "Oh, I dare say someone thought it a convenient hiding place." She looked up at him with a twinkle. "You wouldn't happen to have a spade, would you, Mr. Vale?" He hesitated, then laughed nervously. "You can't be serious." Miss Marple smiled. "I've rarely been more so." What lies beneath? A few minutes later, Ambrose returned from the shed with a garden spade. Together they began to dig, the rain falling softly around them. The soil was damp but loose, turning easily under the blade. After a few strokes, the spade struck something hard. "Careful," Miss Marple said quietly. Ambrose knelt and brushed away the soil. Beneath the roots, wrapped in waxed paper and bound with twine, lay a small metal box, old, weathered, and unmistakably deliberate in its concealment. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. "Oh dear," she murmured. "I do believe we've found Mrs. Dane's final secret." Ambrose's hands trembled as he lifted it free. Good Lord, all this time it was here. "Just where she promised it would be," Miss Marple said gently. "Beneath the garden." They carried the box inside, setting it on the table beside the fire. Miss Marple untied the twine with careful fingers, then peeled back the damp paper. Inside were several packets of folded documents, their edges yellowed, but the writing still clear. Ambrose stared. Letters, contracts, and he stopped. One envelope lay on top, addressed in a firm, elegant hand. To be opened only in the presence of Miss Jane Marple, St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple raised her brows slightly. "Well, that's very thoughtful of her." She opened it delicately. Inside was a single page, written in Mrs. Dane's familiar script. "If you are reading this, I am gone. I feared Martin would find me before I could tell the truth. These papers prove his crimes, the false accounts, the blackmail, the money stolen from his own clients. Ambrose knows none of it. Do not judge him. I trusted only you, Miss Marple. You will see that justice is done. Margaret Dane." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. Poor woman. Even at the end, she was thinking of others. Ambrose sank into a chair, his face pale. "So it's true. Martin did all of it." Miss Marple placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm afraid so. But the truth, Mr. Vale, has a way of surviving even the cleverest of lies." The listening wall. That afternoon, the rain finally stopped. The sun came out briefly, turning the wet garden into a glistening mirror of light. Miss Marple stood by the French doors, gazing out, but her expression was thoughtful, not peaceful. For even as the air cleared, she had noticed something unsettling. During their excavation, she had caught the faintest sound, a creak of gravel beyond the garden wall, the kind that comes from a person standing very still. Someone had been there, watching, listening. And now, she realized, that someone knew the truth was no longer buried. The quiet resolve. That evening, Miss Marple wrote a short note and sealed it in an envelope for Inspector Graves. Then she set the box of papers carefully on the table beside it. If she was right, and she usually was, events would move quickly now. She looked toward the darkening window, where rain still clung to the glass like tears. "Secrets," she murmured, "are like seeds. They grow best when buried, but eventually they come up to the light." And as the wind rose softly over Rosehill, Miss Marple knew that the garden had given up its last confession, but that the true reckoning was yet to come. Chapter 11. The Man Beyond the Wall. Evening settled over Rosehill with a strange stillness, the kind that seems to listen rather than rest. The rain had stopped, but the ground still glistened. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of drenched roses. At the edge of the old coachhouse garden, beneath the ivy-covered stone wall, a small patch of earth bore fresh scars from the morning's digging. Miss Marple, standing by her window in her pale blue shawl, watched the darkness deepen over that very spot. She did not like coincidences. Nor did she believe in them. The faint crunch she'd heard earlier, someone shifting their weight on the gravel beyond the wall, had stayed with her all day like a whisper that refused to fade. The late visitor. At 8:30, a knock came at the door. Not the polite tap of the post or the confident rap of a neighbor. This was softer, hesitant, almost guilty. Miss Marple opened it herself. Standing there was Reverend Hale, the vicar of Rosehill, his umbrella dripping rain onto the mat. His kindly face looked oddly strained. "My dear Miss Marple," he began, "I do hope I'm not intruding. I was on my way home from the parish hall when I saw a light still burning here. I thought, Perhaps I might inquire if all is well." "How very thoughtful of you," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Do come in. You'll find a bit of warmth by the fire." He hesitated before stepping over the threshold. His eyes moved briefly to the table, where the metal box, now closed, still rested. "I heard that you and Mr. Vale made a discovery today," he said after a moment. "A box buried in the garden, wasn't it? The village is all aflutter." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "So soon. Gossip does travel fast, doesn't it? Though I wonder, Reverend, how you heard of it. We've hardly spoken a word since we found it." The vicar flushed. "Oh, well, Mrs. Partridge mentioned something to the grocer, and—" "Ah, yes," she said softly. "Mrs. Partridge. A dear soul, but rather fond of embellishment." There was a long pause. Rain dripped steadily from his umbrella to the floor. Then Miss Marple said, "I imagine you came about something else, Reverend. Shall we sit?" A confession of sorts. They sat by the hearth. The fire crackled softly, throwing long shadows across the walls. Hale folded his hands. "Miss Marple," he said at last, "I've been troubled. Ever since Mrs. Dane's death. I can't quite reconcile it with what we were told. And lately—" "Yes. Lately I've noticed someone skulking about the churchyard at odd hours. A tall man, always wearing a dark coat. He keeps to the edges, near the yew trees. I thought at first it might be Ambrose Vale. Grief does strange things to people, but this man, there's something furtive about him. Watching, waiting." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "How long has this been going on?" "Since the night before the suitcase was found, I think. He was there again last evening. And tonight." He stopped. "Tonight?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "Tonight, I believe he was behind your wall," Hale said quietly. "I saw a figure when I passed by, just beyond the hedgerow." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "Then I was not imagining it." She rose, moved to the sideboard, and poured him a small cup of tea. "You see, Reverend, I believe the man you saw has something to do with Mrs. Dane's missing accounts. There are those who would prefer the truth to remain buried." The vicar accepted the cup, his hand trembling slightly. "But what can we do?" Miss Marple gave a small, serene smile. "Oh, I dare say the police can handle the heavier part. But sometimes it's the small, unnoticed things that bring a villain down. The way he walks, the direction from which he comes, those tell stories too." Footprints in the lane. After the Reverend had gone, Miss Marple fetched a shawl once more and stepped quietly into the garden. The moon was out now, silver and cold, casting sharp shadows on the wet ground. Near the eastern wall, she crouched down. The soil was soft, and yes, there it was, the faint print of a boot. A man's boot, large, with a nick along the sole. The tread was modern, not village-made. She touched it lightly with her gloved hand. The print led toward the narrow lane that ran behind the property, a lane that connected to the churchyard. "Not a local," she murmured. "And not here by chance." From the distance came the faint toll of the church bell, 9 o'clock. The hour hung in the still air like a warning. Miss Marple straightened and looked toward the dark shape of the church tower rising beyond the trees. Her eyes softened, though her voice when she spoke was almost grim. "If he hides among the dead," she said quietly, "then perhaps is afraid of the living." The empty suitcase revisited. Before retiring, she opened the old suitcase once more, the one that had started it all. Its lining, though torn and faded, still carried a faint smell of camphor and lavender. Inside, beneath the false bottom she had discovered days earlier, she found a scrap of fabric she hadn't noticed before, grey wool, frayed at the edge, with a peculiar dark thread stitched along one side. She held it to the light. It was part of a man's coat, heavy, tailored, and unmistakably fine. She folded it gently, then placed it beside her notebook. "The watcher has already been here," she whispered. "And he left something of himself behind." The shadow at the gate. Just as she was extinguishing the lamp, a movement outside caught her eye, a fleeting silhouette by the garden gate. A man's shape, tall and still, half hidden in the mist. For a heartbeat, Miss Marple's old heart gave a flutter of alarm. Then she reached calmly for the telephone and rang Inspector Graves. "Inspector," she said softly, "I believe our visitor from the churchyard has come calling again. If you hurry, You might yet catch him before he vanishes back into the dark. She hung up the receiver, folded her hands, and looked once more toward the window. Outside, the shadow had gone, but the gate swung faintly, back and forth, as if recently touched by an unseen hand. Chapter 12. The Stranger in the Churchyard. The dawn broke over Rosehill with an air of strained expectancy, that peculiar hush that comes when something hidden has been disturbed. Mist clung low to the gravestones in the churchyard, and the morning light spread slowly, revealing the narrow paths that wound between ancient tombs. Inspector Graves stood near the lich-gate, his hat pulled low, his breath fogging the air. He had arrived not long after Miss Marple's call and had brought 2 constables with him. Their boots left damp prints on the cobbles, each sound unnaturally loud in the grey quiet. Miss Marple stood beside him, serene as always, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. "He was here last night," she said softly. "I saw him by my garden gate." The same man Reverend Hale described. Graves nodded grimly. "We'll search the grounds before the villagers start arriving for the morning service. Whoever he is, he's been clever, too clever by half." Miss Marple's eyes drifted over the churchyard, the ivy-clad walls, the ancient yews, the small, forgotten stones leaning at crooked angles. "Cleverness, Inspector, can be rather like pride," she murmured. "It often ends by revealing more than it conceals." A trail through the mist. The constables spread out, lanterns cutting pale beams through the fog. One called out softly, a shape moving near the far boundary, where the ground sloped toward the woods. Graves motioned for silence. Together they approached, boots squelching in the wet earth. A man stood by the far wall, his back half turned, as though studying the graves. His coat was long, dark, and wet at the hem. In one gloved hand, he held a walking stick, though there was something faintly theatrical about the way he gripped it. "Good morning," Graves said evenly. "I don't believe we've been introduced." The man turned. He was tall, pale, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to measure everything at once. His voice, when he spoke, was cultured, calm, too calm. "Inspector Graves, isn't it? I'm afraid I've been caught trespassing. You see, I was simply paying my respects." "To whom?" Graves asked. The man smiled faintly. "To the late Mrs. Dane. We were acquainted." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Acquainted in what way, sir?" He looked at her then, and for just an instant something flickered in his eyes, recognition. "My name is Lawrence Dane," he said quietly. "Margaret was my wife." The return of the dead man. The constables exchanged startled glances. Miss Marple alone remained still, her gaze calm but piercing. "That's quite impossible," she said gently. "Mrs. Dane's husband died years ago, in a motor accident near Dover, wasn't it?" "So the records say," he replied. "A convenient fiction, I'm afraid. For her protection, and mine." Inspector Graves' jaw tightened. "Are you telling us you faked your own death?" Lawrence Dane gave a small, weary smile. "You make it sound so dramatic, Inspector. I simply removed myself. Margaret and I had become entangled in certain matters best forgotten. She knew too much about people who preferred their accounts unexamined. I disappeared to keep her safe." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And yet she ended up dead." His smile faded. "Yes," he said quietly. "So much for good intentions." The letter in the pocket. Graves gestured for the constables to stand aside. "You'll understand, Mr. Dane, that I'll need to ask a few questions, at the station." "Of course," he said, though his eyes darted briefly toward Miss Marple. "But before that, perhaps I can offer you something." He reached slowly into his inner pocket and withdrew a folded envelope, worn at the edges. "Margaret wrote this to you, Miss Marple. She asked me to deliver it if anything ever happened to her." Miss Marple accepted it with steady hands. The paper was damp from the mist, the ink blurred in places. She opened it carefully. "Dear Miss Marple, if Lawrence ever returns, you will know the truth at last. There are those who think him dead, by his own design. I could never tell the police. The risk was too great. But the documents in the box will make sense only when his name is restored to them. He was both my sin and my salvation. Forgive me. Margaret." Miss Marple folded the letter with a sigh. "Poor soul," she murmured. She loved him still, even after all the lies. The inspector's doubt. Inspector Graves studied Lawrence Dane closely. You say you disappeared for her safety, yet you've been skulking in graveyards and lurking about her home. That doesn't sound protective to me. Dane's composure faltered. I didn't kill her, if that's what you mean. I came back because I heard her brother, Martin, was blackmailing her again. She wrote to me, asked for help. By the time I arrived, she was gone. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. And the suitcase? He hesitated. That wasn't mine. But I recognized it. It belonged to Martin Vale. I believe he hid something inside it. Something that could ruin him. Then why were you hiding behind my wall last night? She asked softly. Dane's face tightened. Because I saw the police take that box from your garden. I thought they'd found it, the ledger. If it fell into the wrong hands, more lives than mine would be destroyed. The shadow of the truth. The mist began to lift, revealing the churchyard in pale gold light. Graves motioned to the constables. Take him in. We'll sort his story properly. As they led Lawrence Dane away, he turned once to Miss Marple. Tell them, Miss Marple. Tell them I wasn't her enemy. I don't yet know who was, she replied. But I shall. The whisper in the vestry. Later, when the police had gone, Miss Marple lingered in the church. The pews were empty, and the silence seemed heavy with secrets. She noticed something then, a faint draft near the vestry door. The small side window was ajar, and beneath it, half hidden behind a stack of hymn books, lay a crumpled scrap of paper. She picked it up and smoothed it gently. It was part of a torn letter, the same stationery as Margaret Dane's last note. Only a few words remained legible. He'll never let it reach London. He said the suitcase must vanish first. Miss Marple read it twice, her expression grave. Then she tucked it into her handbag. Oh, my dear Mrs. Dane, she whispered. Even from the grave you're still warning us. The question is, from whom? Chapter 13. The Man Who Feared the Ledger. It was one of those cold, metallic mornings in Rosehill when even the sunlight seemed reluctant. The sky hung pale and thin, the kind of day when breath showed in the air and every sound carried farther than it should. Miss Marple sat by the small fire in her sitting room, a teacup warming her hands, as she reviewed the contents of her notebook. Her handwriting, small and precise, filled several pages. Names, times, remarks overheard in passing, and the smallest of gestures noted beside them. She underlined one entry twice. Ledger, missing, financial ties between Vale family and London firm, Bexley and Harcourt. That was the true heart of it all, she thought, the ledger. The book that had frightened Martin Vale enough to bury a box, that had driven Lawrence Dane from the shadows, and perhaps, in the end, led to Margaret Dane's death. The inspector's visit. A knock came at 10:30. Inspector Graves entered, brushing the morning chill from his coat. He looked tired, but alert. Miss Marple, he greeted. I thought I'd find you in the middle of something. You always are. Just my little notes, Inspector, she said with a smile. Do sit down. There's hot tea and, if you're feeling brave, some currant biscuits. Graves chuckled softly. I could do with both. We've had Dane in all night. He's sticking to his story. Claims Martin Vale ran a fraudulent investment scheme using his sister's name as cover. The ledger apparently holds proof. Does he say where it is? That's the trouble. He swears he doesn't know. He says Margaret hid it from both him and her brother before she died. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. If Margaret truly feared her brother, she would never have kept something so dangerous in the house. Yet she wanted it found, eventually. She left letters, clues, even buried papers under the roses. She meant for the truth to emerge, but only when it could no longer harm the innocent. Graves leaned forward. And you think you know where the ledger is? I believe I may know where it was, she said quietly. But whether it remains, there is another question entirely. The visit to Bexley and Harcourt. By noon, Miss Marple and Inspector Graves were on the train to London. The countryside rolled past, damp fields, bare hedgerows, and the faint glimmer of frost on the rails. Their destination was a tall, grey building on King's Row, headquarters of Bexley and Harcourt, solicitors and estate managers. Inside, it smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. A young clerk led them upstairs to Mr. Edmund Harcourt, a heavyset man with thinning hair and cautious eyes. When Graves introduced himself, Harcourt's smile tightened. "Ah yes, the Dane matter. Tragic business. We were rather fond of Mrs. Dane here. Very capable woman, handled her late husband's estate admirably." Miss Marple's expression was mild. "I imagine her affairs were quite extensive." "Oh, indeed," Harcourt said. "She held certain shares, some investments, small things. Nothing remarkable." "Then you won't mind," Miss Marple said gently, "if we inquire about her brother's account." The man's hand, resting on the desk, froze. "Her brother? Martin Vale?" "Yes," said Graves. "We understand he did some work through your firm, or pretended to." Harcourt shifted in his chair. "I'm afraid I can't discuss private clients without authorization." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Authorization is such a flexible thing, Mr. Harcourt. I expect the police can provide it before luncheon, though it might be simpler if you were to tell us what you know." For a long moment, Harcourt hesitated. Then, with a faint sigh, he opened a drawer and took out a single envelope marked confidential, Vale. "I kept this aside," he said quietly. "Mrs. Dane sent it to us 3 weeks before her death. She said it contained corrections to certain ledgers her brother had filed with us. But when I opened it after she died, the ledger itself was missing. Only this note remained." He passed it across the desk. "To be kept safe until the day Martin Vale faces his own reflection. The truth lies where his greed began, at the crossing of the old and the new." Miss Marple read it twice, her eyes gleaming. "How very like her," she murmured. "Precise, poetic, and entirely practical. The crossing of the old and the new." Back in Rosehill that evening, Miss Marple sat again by her fire, the note spread before her. Where his greed began, at the crossing of the old and the new. She thought of Martin Vale's property dealings, the new modern cottages he'd built on land once belonging to the old mill. The old mill road intersected with Newbridge Lane, a literal crossing of the old and new. Her eyes brightened. "Oh, dear me," she whispered. "It's always so much simpler than the villains imagine." Under the mill bridge. By morning, she was there, accompanied by Graves and a constable with a lantern. The mill had long been abandoned, its wheel rotted and half buried in reeds. Beneath the bridge, where the two roads met, the air smelled of moss and old water. "Here," she said, pointing to a stone slab half sunken in the mud. Mrs. Dane must have known her brother would never think to look where he began his own deceit. The constable pried it up carefully. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a book, thick, water-stained, but unmistakably a ledger. Graves lifted it, brushing off mud. "Got it," he said softly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "So the heart of the story is found. Now, Inspector, we shall see who truly feared the ledger most, and why Margaret Dane had to die." A silent watcher. As they left, Miss Marple paused on the bridge and glanced toward the trees. A shape moved there, faint, silent, watching. It was not Lawrence Dane, nor Ambrose Vale. Someone else, slimmer, quick, half concealed by mist. And when she looked again, the figure was gone. "Ah," she murmured. "So the real player steps forward at last." Chapter 14. The Secret at the Mill Bridge. The following morning dawned pale and cold, with frost whitening the hedges and rooftops of Rosehill. Inside the small police office adjoining the post, a single lamp burned as Inspector Graves leaned over the newly recovered ledger. His breath came slow and deliberate, part astonishment, part grim satisfaction. The ledger, though water-stained, had survived remarkably well. Its pages were filled with fine, slanted handwriting, neat to the point of obsession. Figures and initials crowded the margins, and between the lines, Miss Marple could already see the glint of deceit, the quiet kind that thrives behind respectability. She sat across from Graves, her knitting bag at her feet, a ball of pale wool resting like a small ghost beside her chair. The hidden accounts. Graves turned another page. "She was right," he said. "Every line of this proves Martin Vale was using the Dane estate to funnel money into fake investment accounts. He took funds meant for village charities, even church repairs, and moved them through a company called Northbridge Holdings." "Northbridge Holdings," Miss Marple repeated softly. "A name meant to sound trustworthy, I suppose. And yet," she pointed with a gloved finger, "see how it connects back to Bexley and Harcourt. Every deposit cross-referenced here matches one of their London ledgers. But these initials, LD, appear throughout. Graves frowned. You think that's Lawrence Dane? Possibly, she said. Or someone using his name. But look, this entry, payment to LD, coded via Valehouse accounts, 3 days before MD's death. Doesn't that seem rather convenient? Graves swore under his breath. If that payment came from Martin, it could mean Lawrence was being framed, or paid off. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. And that, Inspector, is the question, isn't it? Who truly feared exposure, the thief or the witness? A visit from Ambrose Vale. Before they could continue, the door opened and Ambrose Vale stepped in. He looked haggard, as though he hadn't slept since the day before. I heard you found something, he said without preamble. The ledger. May I see it? Graves hesitated. It's evidence, Mr. Vale. Best you leave it to us for now. Ambrose's eyes darkened. Evidence against whom, Inspector? My brother, or myself? Miss Marple's voice was soft but steady. Neither, if truth prevails. But you must tell us, when your brother handled those accounts, did he ever mention Northbridge Holdings? He hesitated. Yes, he said finally. He told me it was an investment firm, something to do with agricultural land. I signed a few papers, but I never understood them. He said it was safer that way. Miss Marple exchanged a quiet glance with Graves. Mr. Vale, she said, I believe you may have been used as a silent partner, the respectable face of a very unrespectable enterprise. Ambrose's shoulders slumped. And Margaret knew. Yes, Miss Marple said gently, and tried to protect you, until she realized the money was being moved again. When she threatened to reveal it, she became a liability. His eyes widened. You think Martin killed her? Miss Marple's reply was calm but certain. I think he intended to silence her, but I don't yet believe he was the one who succeeded. The ledger's last page. They reached the final entries, written shakily, as though by a different hand. At the bottom of the last page, beneath a column of false balances, a message had been scribbled hastily. If this reaches Rosehill before I do, he's found me. The key is in the church. Behind what hides the light. Graves looked up sharply. What hides the light? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Ah, yes. Mrs. Dane did enjoy her riddles. I imagine she means the church lantern, the old one above the vestry window. It's covered by a wooden panel, isn't it? Graves nodded. Been there for years. Barely noticed. Then perhaps, Miss Marple said, rising and gathering her shawl, it's time we had a closer look. The lantern in the vestry. The church stood silent under the WAN afternoon light. Inside, dust floated through the cold air like drifting ash. Miss Marple climbed the narrow steps to the vestry window while Graves held the lantern below. The wooden cover was fixed loosely, as though someone had replaced it in haste. She pried it open with the handle of her umbrella. Something fell, a small brass key, tied with a scrap of faded ribbon. Graves caught it. What on earth? Not a church key, Miss Marple murmured, examining it. Too finely made. More like something from a travel case, perhaps a lockbox. Her eyes brightened. Or an empty suitcase. The key that shouldn't exist. They returned to Miss Marple's cottage, where the infamous empty suitcase still rested near the fireplace. The lock had long been broken open, or so they thought. But when Miss Marple fitted the small brass key into the side clasp, the one no one had noticed before, it turned smoothly. A hidden compartment sprang open. Inside lay a folded document, sealed with wax and stamped with the crest of Bexley and Harcourt. Graves whistled. Well, I'll be damned. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. It was a confession, signed and dated. I, Martin Vale, have been party to the falsification of ledgers concerning estate holdings belonging to Mrs. Margaret Dane. The proceeds were laundered through Northbridge Holdings at the instruction of. The name that followed stopped Graves cold. Edmund Harcourt. The smile of the spider. Miss Marple leaned back, her face unreadable. So our cautious solicitor spun more than paper webs. He created the scheme, used Martin Vale to front it, and arranged for Mrs. Dane's silence when she discovered the truth. But perhaps Martin was too frightened to kill her, and so Harcourt found another way. Graves muttered. He's been hiding behind his desk all this time. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. And now, I think, he's beginning to realize his web is tearing. She closed the suitcase gently, her eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction. The empty suitcase, she said, was never empty at all. It carried the weight of every lie in Rosehill. Chapter 15. The Man at King's Row. The train from Rosehill to London rolled through fields shrouded in thin fog. Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, her gloved hands folded atop her handbag. Across from her, Inspector Graves reviewed his notes for what must have been the 10th time. Every so often, he looked up as if to speak, but something about Miss Marple's serene composure kept him silent. At last, he muttered, "I can't quite believe it, Miss Marple." Edmund Harcourt. The man's a solicitor of 30 years' standing, a pillar of respectability, executor to half the estates in this county. And yet... Miss Marple smiled faintly, eyes still on the grey countryside sliding past. Respectability, Inspector, is very often the neatest disguise of all, especially for those who know how to manipulate it. Graves grunted, still unconvinced. We'll see if he's quite so respectable when he's faced with that confession. Indeed, said Miss Marple softly. But be careful, Inspector. Men like Mr. Harcourt seldom panic. They calculate. They prepare. And when cornered, they don't fight, they arrange. The solicitor's office. King's Row, in the heart of London, was a street of elegant stone buildings and quiet wealth. The brass plate on the door of Bexley and Harcourt gleamed despite the grey morning. Inside, the air was warm and scented faintly of leather and tobacco. A young clerk, pale and nervous, led them through to Harcourt's office. Mr. Edmund Harcourt rose as they entered. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a face of polished civility. He smiled, though his eyes did not. "Inspector Graves, isn't it? And Miss Marple, I believe. I've heard of you." His voice was smooth, almost pleasant. "Do sit down. I gather this is about the unfortunate business in Rosehill." Graves wasted no time. "We're here because your name has come up in connection with Mrs. Dane's death, and certain irregularities in her estate accounts." Harcourt raised an eyebrow. "Irregularities? Good heavens, surely you don't mean to suggest—" Miss Marple's quiet voice interrupted. "I believe, Mr. Harcourt, that you were aware of Mr. Martin Vale's misappropriations. More than aware, complicit. You arranged for funds to be redirected through your firm's shell accounts, using Northbridge Holdings as a front. And when Mrs. Dane discovered the truth, she paused delicately, she became inconvenient." For a heartbeat, Harcourt's composure flickered. Then he smiled again, tighter this time. "That is a very serious accusation, Miss Marple. I do hope you have more than a village gossip's word to support it." Inspector Graves dropped the folded confession onto the polished desk. The calm before the snare. Harcourt picked it up, his expression unreadable. As his eyes scanned the page, his hand stilled for the briefest moment, then resumed turning it as though it were a trivial memorandum. "Remarkable," he said mildly. "But forged, of course. Martin Vale was unstable. You'll find he's written half a dozen contradictory statements in his time. This one means nothing." Graves leaned forward. "It means enough to warrant a full inquiry into your firm. You'll surrender all client ledgers and correspondence relating to Northbridge Holdings." Harcourt met his gaze evenly. "You'll have to get a warrant first." Miss Marple smiled, faint and almost kind. "Oh, I think you'll find the warrant already issued, Mr. Harcourt. Inspector Graves is merely being polite." Harcourt's eyes narrowed. "I see. Then I must insist you leave my office at once. My solicitor—" "Your solicitor," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "was Mr. Bexley, was he not? The same man who died so suddenly last autumn, under what the papers called unfortunate circumstances." Silence filled the room. Graves watched Harcourt's face, the tightening jaw, the slight shift of his right hand toward the drawer of his desk. "Careful," Graves said sharply. "Let's keep hands where I can see them." Harcourt's hand froze, then withdrew slowly. He gave a small, brittle laugh. "You think I'd be foolish enough to shoot an officer in my own office?" Miss Marple's voice, calm and unshaken, replied, "Oh, no, Mr. Harcourt. But I think you might be foolish enough to destroy what's in that drawer, the true ledgers, the correspondence, the receipts Mrs. Dane refused to sign. That's why we came unannounced. The letter beneath the drawer. Harcourt's composure cracked. You've no proof, he said tightly. None. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, rising and walking toward the bookcase. We have more than enough, though perhaps not quite where you expect. She reached for a leather-bound law volume on the shelf, the Statutes of 1890. The moment she lifted it, a folded envelope fell from behind. Graves caught it. The wax seal bore Harcourt's crest. Inside were 3 letters, one from Martin Vale, pleading for more time, another from Margaret Dane, threatening to expose the scheme, and a third, unsigned, written in a precise, cold hand. Meet me by Mill Bridge at midnight. Bring the suitcase. If you fail, you'll not live to regret it. Miss Marple's eyes were sorrowful. Your handwriting, Mr. Harcourt. You wrote it yourself. Harcourt's calm broke completely. He stood, trembling slightly. She was going to ruin me, he whispered. After all I did for her husband, for that estate, for the whole damned village. She was going to tell the truth, Miss Marple said quietly. And you could not bear to lose your illusion of respectability. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Graves stepped forward and took Harcourt by the arm. Edmund Harcourt, I'm arresting you for the murder of Margaret Dane. The smile in the fog. As they left the building, the fog had thickened outside, muffling the city's noise. Graves walked ahead with Harcourt in custody, while Miss Marple lingered for a moment on the steps. She watched the passing carriages, the grey London air, and thought of Rosehill, quiet again, but forever changed. The wind caught her scarf, and she smiled faintly. People do such strange things for the sake of their reputations, she murmured. It's a pity, really. The truth would have suited him far better. She turned, following the inspector toward the waiting cab. Behind them, the brass plate of Bexley and Harcourt gleamed faintly in the fog, polished, perfect, and utterly hollow. Chapter 16. The Truth Beneath Rosehill. The train back to Rosehill rattled gently through the dusk. Miss Marple sat by the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, a small, composed figure, lost in quiet thought. Inspector Graves, seated across from her, tapped the side of his notebook impatiently. It seems too tidy, doesn't it? We have the confession, the motive, the letters, even Harcourt's reaction. It all lines up neatly. Almost too neatly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That's because life rarely ties itself into a bow, Inspector. And I suspect that Harcourt's guilt, though certain, may not be the whole story. Graves frowned. Not the whole story. He blackmailed Mrs. Dane, killed her when she threatened him, and used Martin Vale as a scapegoat. What else could there be? Miss Marple adjusted her shawl. Oh, human nature always adds a little more embroidery to the cloth, Inspector. The question is, who held the needle first? A cold return. When they reached Rosehill, night had fallen, and the village lay under a thin frost. The lamps glowed like small halos in the mist. Outside the station, Ambrose Vale was waiting, his face pale but determined. Inspector, Miss Marple, he said breathlessly. I've just come from the manor. Someone's broken into my brother's old study. Graves stiffened. When? About an hour ago. The housekeeper heard a window smash, but by the time she went to look, whoever it was had gone. Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with quiet alarm. Then we must hurry, Mr. Vale. I believe the final act of this little drama may already have begun. The study in shadows. They arrived at the Vale estate just after 9. The great house loomed dark against the fog, its windows reflecting the faint glimmer of the moon. Inside, the study was in disarray, drawers open, papers strewn across the floor, the air thick with dust and something faintly metallic. Inspector Graves bent to examine a broken window latch. Forced from the outside, he muttered. And whoever did it knew exactly where to look. Miss Marple moved slowly around the room, eyes tracing the disordered papers. They were searching for something very specific, she murmured. And I dare say they found it. Ambrose Vale frowned. But what could still be here? You have the ledger, the confession. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, but there was one thing we never recovered, the missing second suitcase. Graves looked up sharply. Second suitcase. Miss Marple nodded. The maid mentioned it, you may recall, the pair of matching travel cases Mrs. Dane had packed. We found only one empty, but the other was never reported, never seen since the night she died. The footprints in frost. They followed a faint trail of footprints from the study door through the garden. The frost had caught them clearly, a man's steps, hurried and deep, leading toward the old mill bridge at the edge of the estate. When they reached the bridge, the mist hung thick above the river. The sound of water below was soft, almost secretive. And there, half hidden beneath the bridge's stone arch, they found it, a battered brown suitcase, crusted with mud and ice. Its brass lock was snapped, but the lid remained closed as though reluctant to reveal its contents. Inspector Graves knelt and opened it. Inside were bundles of letters, account ledgers, and bank drafts, all neatly wrapped and sealed with the same crest they had seen on Harcourt's documents. But on top of everything lay a single folded sheet, written in a familiar, elegant hand. Margaret Dane's final letter. Miss Marple took it gently and began to read aloud. If this should be found, let it be known that I do not fear death. I have trusted too long in the goodness of others, and in my own silence. Martin has done wrong, but not alone. There are others who guided his hand, who profited by his weakness. But there is one whom I trusted more than any other, and he has betrayed us all. Should I fail to return from the bridge tonight, you will find the truth in the accounts marked Rosehill Fund. The rest is in the keeping of conscience. M.D. Graves looked up. She names Harcourt without naming him. This seals it. Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Her eyes were distant, thoughtful. No, Inspector, it doesn't quite seal it. Notice how she writes of trust and betrayal. That implies someone closer than Harcourt, someone she felt affection for. Ambrose Vale's face had gone white. Closer? What do you mean? The final realization. Miss Marple turned to him gently. Mr. Vale, when your brother died, you inherited everything, the estate, the remaining funds, even the trust Mrs. Dane helped manage. And yet, by all accounts, she visited you frequently, confided in you. I must ask, did she ever give you documents to keep safe? Ambrose's lips parted. I don't remember. She may have. Miss Marple's gaze was kind, almost sorrowful. I think you do. I think she trusted you with the second suitcase, knowing you would not look inside. And when Harcourt learned of it, he blackmailed you, to keep quiet, to protect the family name. Ambrose trembled. He said it was only money, that no one would be hurt if I just signed a few papers. Miss Marple finished softly. Yes. And when Margaret threatened to expose it, Harcourt forced you to bring her to the bridge that night. A terrible silence fell. The sound of the river deepened. Ambrose whispered. He told me it was only to frighten her. That she'd be taken abroad, made to disappear. I didn't know he'd. He covered his face, voice breaking. I didn't know she'd die. Inspector Graves stepped forward, his expression grave. Mr. Vale, you're saying you were at the bridge that night? Ambrose nodded weakly. Yes. I met her there. Harcourt was waiting. I left before it happened. Miss Marple's face softened, though her voice was firm. You bore your guilt quietly, Mr. Vale. But guilt, like the frost, always leaves its trace. The dawn at Rosehill. By morning, the truth was written plainly in every heart. Harcourt's arrest was confirmed. Ambrose's confession sealed the story. He was charged as an accessory but, on Miss Marple's quiet insistence, treated with compassion. When Miss Marple left the manor, the first sunlight of winter brushed the hills beyond Rosehill. The frost melted from the hedges, and the church bells began to ring. She paused on the path, glancing once more toward the river. It is curious, she murmured, how even the emptiest suitcase may carry the heaviest burden of all. She drew her shawl tighter and walked back toward her cottage, calm, composed, and quietly triumphant. Chapter 18. The Letter in the Hearth. The snow lingered over Rosehill for several days, softening the edges of cottages and hedgerows, and muffling the world in a gentle, dreamlike silence. Miss Marple's garden, usually neat and tidy even in winter, now looked like a white lace quilt stretched over the earth. Inside her little cottage, the fire crackled warmly. A pot of tea steamed on the side table, and the faint tick of the mantel clock counted the peaceful seconds. Miss Marple had spent the morning mending a pair of worn gloves, not hers, of course, but belonging to the vicar's wife, who never quite got the knack of proper stitching. Her hands moved calmly, methodically, but her mind, as ever, wandered far beyond the ordinary. The Harcourt case was formally closed, yet something, some faint, persistent thread, continued to tug at her thoughts. It was nearly noon when a knock came at the door. A parcel from the past. When she opened it, the postman stood there, stamping snow from his boots. "Morning, Miss Marple. Bit of a strange one for you today. Came through the London post, no return address, but looks old." He handed her a small brown envelope, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the ink smudged and faint. "Thank you, Mr. Fenton," she said pleasantly. "I do like strange ones." When he had gone, she carried the letter to the fire, sat down, and examined it carefully. The seal, a small circle pressed with the initials MD, sent a ripple of quiet recognition through her. Margaret Dane. Miss Marple broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet within. The writing was shaky, rushed, and in places nearly illegible. But the voice behind it was unmistakably that of the late Mrs. Dane, kind, intelligent, and weary. Margaret's final words. "If ever this should reach you, Miss Marple, for I know you have the mind of one who listens to what others do not say, I wish to tell you something no one else would believe. It is not only money or deceit that binds Rosehill in silence. There are old things, older than any of us, buried beneath the mill, in the place where the first bridge stood. Lawrence believed he heard whispers there once, when the water was low. I think the truth lies deeper than theft or pride. And if I should die before I can speak it, perhaps you will see it more clearly than I. Forgive Ambrose. He was misled, as I once was. Tell him that kindness can be heavy, but it must not turn to guilt. Yours sincerely, Margaret Dane." Miss Marple sat very still, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. Outside, the wind whispered faintly around the eaves, almost as if echoing the words of the dead. At last, she folded the letter again and stared into the fire. "Old things beneath the mill," she murmured. "Whispers, guilt, and forgiveness. How curious, and how very like human nature to bury its truth both in the heart and in the ground." A visit from Inspector Graves. By mid-afternoon, Inspector Graves had arrived, his boots crusted with snow and his breath clouding in the cold. He removed his hat respectfully. "Got your message, Miss Marple. Something about another letter." She handed it to him. He read it slowly, frowning. "So she wrote to you before she died? That's remarkable. Though I confess I don't see what she means by things beneath the mill. You don't think she was losing her grip, do you?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. I think she was clearer than ever." Margaret Dane wasn't one to speak in riddles for her own amusement. When she said something was buried, I believe she meant it quite literally. Graves frowned, skeptical but intrigued. "You mean evidence? Something Harcourt might have hidden?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said. "Or perhaps something even older, records, letters, perhaps the very foundation of his deceit." Graves nodded. "Well, we could have a look tomorrow. No harm in checking." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, Inspector, but perhaps not tomorrow. Tonight, when no one's watching. Secrets prefer the dark." The mill at night. The old Rosehill mill stood on the far side of the river, half in ruin and half defiant against time. The water wheel had long stopped turning, its paddles stiff with ice. By lantern light, Graves and Miss Marple crossed the footbridge, the boards creaking beneath them. Inside, the air smelled of damp stone and old grain. Miss Marple's keen eyes traced the floor, noticing faint irregularities near the far wall, as though boards had once been pried up and nailed again. "Here," she said softly. "Bring the light closer." Graves knelt and pried at one of the planks with his penknife. It came loose with a groan of old wood. Beneath lay a small cavity, and in it, wrapped in oiled cloth, something gleamed faintly. He pulled it out. A small tin box, rusted but intact. Inside were photographs, sepia-toned, grainy, showing Harcourt and Martin Vale together at various estates, smiling as if at business meetings. But among them was one more curious image. Mrs. Dane, standing beside Ambrose Vale and a man in clerical robes, the old vicar, long deceased, with the mill bridge behind them, newly rebuilt. On the back, in Margaret's hand, were the words, "This bridge was built upon another," and beneath that, something no one must ever find again. Graves stared. What in heaven's name does that mean? Miss Marple gazed at the photo for a long moment, her eyes full of calm understanding. "It means, my dear Inspector," she said softly, "that some sins are older than memory, and that Rosehill's peace was built on the silence of the past." The fire's gentle glow. Back at her cottage that night, Miss Marple placed the photograph and letter side by side on her writing desk. The fire glowed low, casting soft golden light across the paper. She picked up her pen and began to write a small note to the local historical society, suggesting a survey of the river foundations for safety's sake. Then she set her pen down, folded her hands, and smiled faintly. "Justice," she murmured, "is a curious thing. It comes in layers, the visible, and the kind only time can uncover." The wind outside sighed through the snow-laden trees, carrying with it the echo of the river's whisper. Chapter 19. The Shadow Beneath the Bridge. The next morning dawned cold and colourless. A thin mist drifted above the river, cloaking the old mill and the bridge in a ghostly shroud. Even the crows seemed subdued, their cries faint and distant in the damp air. Miss Marple, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, stood at her cottage window, watching the faint trail of smoke rise from the chimneys along Rosehill's High Street. Everything appeared so peaceful, as though the village wished to forget the unpleasant business that had shaken it. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that peace, in such places, was often a delicate illusion, a thin crust covering a slow, simmering truth. The letter from Margaret Dane and the photograph from the mill lay on her table, side by side, like two pieces of a puzzle nearly complete. There was still something missing, some vital connection she had yet to see. A quiet visit. Inspector Graves arrived just before noon, his manner brisk and businesslike. "Morning, Miss Marple. I've arranged for a small team to inspect under the bridge, just to be thorough. Would you care to join us?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "If it's no trouble, Inspector. I do find fresh air rather invigorating, even if it's somewhat damp." Graves chuckled. "A bit of mud never stopped you before." Together, they set off toward the river. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing the glimmer of sunlight on the water. Several constables were already there, their boots sinking in the wet earth. One of them, young Constable Peters, saluted awkwardly. "We've found something, sir. Looks like old stonework below the current bridge. Could be the remains of an earlier structure." Graves nodded. "Careful with it. Let's have a closer look." The unearthed chamber. What they found was astonishing. Beneath the new stonework, hidden under layers of soil and moss, was a small vaulted chamber, perhaps an old mill cellar or part of the original bridge foundation. The men worked carefully, prying away damp boards and clearing rubble until the entrance gaped open like a mouth breathing centuries-old air. Graves held the lantern high, its light glinting on slick stone. "It's narrow. I'll go first." Miss Marple placed a steady hand on his arm. "Do mind your step, Inspector. Things buried long ago are often best approached gently." Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of water and decay. The chamber was small, no more than 8 feet across, but in one corner stood a rotted wooden crate, its lid warped and half collapsed. Graves knelt, pried it open, and drew back with a soft exclamation. Inside were bones. Old bones, yellowed with age, still faintly wrapped in the tatters of what had once been a clerical robe. A silence fell over the group, a silence so thick it seemed to absorb even the sound of the river above. Miss Marple, peering over Graves's shoulder, said softly, "So that is what Margaret Dane meant. Something no one must ever find again." The forgotten vicar. Later that afternoon, in the village constabulary office, the atmosphere was tense. Graves stood by the window, pipe in hand, staring at the grey sky. "The coroner's man says the bones could be at least 70 years old," he said. "And the fabric matches clerical wear from that period. That's about the time Reverend Carston vanished, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes. The old vicar of Rosehill. I remember reading of it in the parish notes, a tragic accident near the river, though no body was ever found." Graves turned. "You think that's him?" "I do," she said simply. "And I think his death was no accident." Graves frowned. "But what's the connection to Harcourt's murder? Surely the two can't." "Oh, but they can, Inspector. Secrets of that magnitude never die quietly. They fester, and in time, they breed new ones. She reached for the photograph once more and pointed to the faces: Mrs. Dane, Ambrose Vale, and the late Reverend Carston. Notice how they stand, Inspector. Margaret is between the two men, as though keeping peace. But look closely, Ambrose's hand is gripping the vicar's shoulder. Too tightly for comfort. Graves squinted. You think there was bad blood? Miss Marple nodded. I think Ambrose Vale and the Reverend quarrelled over something far more serious than money. Perhaps a sin the church could not forgive, or a scandal that might have destroyed them both. An old sin, a new crime. As the daylight faded, the village buzzed with fresh gossip. A body under the bridge. Whispers flew from the post office to the grocer's shop, each version more dramatic than the last. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly at her hearth, the flickering fire reflected in her eyes. If Reverend Carston had been murdered, then his death had been hidden, covered by generations who preferred silence over truth. And if Harcourt had discovered that secret, it might explain his greed, his fear, and his death. People rarely kill for the past, she murmured to herself, but they often kill to keep it buried. A confession at dusk. That evening, just as the church bell struck 7, there was a knock at Miss Marple's door. Ambrose Vale stood there, pale, trembling, his hat crushed between his hands. Miss Marple, he said hoarsely, I heard what they found, beneath the bridge. Yes, she said calmly. You knew it was there, didn't you, Mr. Vale? He swallowed hard. I suspected. My father told me once, when I was a boy, that something terrible had happened long ago. He made me swear never to go near the mill. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but unrelenting. And yet you did. You found the remains, didn't you? And you told Harcourt. His eyes widened. How did you? Because that was the true hold he had over you, she said. Not the embezzlement, not the fraud, but knowledge. He knew your family's secret. And you, poor man, were too frightened to expose it. Tears filled Ambrose's eyes. It wasn't me who killed Harcourt. But I didn't stop it either. I knew Margaret had gone to him that night, to beg him to destroy the papers. She said she'd make it right. He covered his face with his hands. And now she's gone too. God help me, I think she knew how it would end. Miss Marple said softly, perhaps she did. But she wanted the truth to be known, in her own way. The river's voice. Later, when he had gone, Miss Marple stepped outside. The river murmured softly under the bridge, its voice calm and eternal. The snow had melted, revealing the dark stones beneath. She stood there for a long time, the lantern light flickering in her hand. The shadows beneath the bridge no longer frightened her. They simply reminded her of what she had always known. That time does not wash everything away. The past, she whispered, always waits for someone brave enough to listen. Chapter 20. The Final Trick. The morning after Ambrose Vale's visit dawned crisp and clear. The mist that had haunted Rosehill for days had finally lifted, leaving the world bright but strangely still, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, her knitting untouched, her tea gone cold. The events of the previous night had settled in her mind like the final pieces of a jigsaw. She could see the full picture now, and it was both tragic and inevitable. Margaret Dane's letter, the bones beneath the bridge, Harcourt's greed and fear, and the empty suitcase, the one that had started everything. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled faintly, though there was no mirth in them. Yes, she murmured. It's time. Inspector Graves arrives. By mid-morning, Inspector Graves arrived at her cottage, brushing frost from his coat. Morning, Miss Marple. You asked me to come, said it was urgent. Yes, Inspector. Quite urgent. Do sit down. He did, somewhat warily. He had learned that when Miss Marple was calmest, something extraordinary was about to happen. I believe, she said, we are ready to expose our murderer. Graves raised an eyebrow. You mean Vale? No, she said simply. Mr. Vale has his sins, but murder is not one of them. He was a frightened man, a coward, perhaps, but not a killer. Graves frowned. Then who? Miss Marple rose and crossed to her writing desk. From its drawer, she withdrew a small object wrapped in linen. She placed it on the table and slowly unwrapped it. It was the empty suitcase, brown leather, scuffed with travel and time. Graves looked puzzled. That old thing again. What can it possibly tell us now? Miss Marple smiled faintly. It already has, Inspector. The question is, will the killer realize what it no longer contains? The gathering at Dane House. At her request, Inspector Graves summoned everyone connected to the case, Ambrose Vale, Clara Dane, and even young Martin Vale. They met that afternoon in the drawing room of Dane House, where the fire burned brightly but the atmosphere was cold as stone. Miss Marple sat quietly in an armchair, the suitcase on the floor beside her. Inspector Graves stood near the hearth, arms folded. When all were present, she began. "My friends," she said, "we have all lived under the shadow of deception, old and new. A murder was committed not out of greed alone, but out of fear. Fear that the truth of the past would come to light." Clara Dane's hands twisted in her lap. "Please, Miss Marple, what truth?" Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "Your mother, Mrs. Dane, wrote to me before her death. She knew something terrible had been hidden beneath the bridge, the body of Reverend Carston. He was murdered long ago, and his death was concealed by those who built their lives upon that silence. Your father, Ambrose Vale's father, and Mrs. Dane's husband were all bound by that sin." A gasp escaped Clara's lips. Ambrose Vale bowed his head. "But that old crime alone," Miss Marple continued, "did not lead to Mr. Harcourt's death. No, he died because someone feared he would use that knowledge for his own gain. He had discovered the truth and tried to profit from it." Graves stepped forward. "Then who killed him, Miss Marple?" She turned her eyes toward the window, where the afternoon light caught the suitcase's worn leather. The person who had access to Harcourt's luggage that night, who knew where it was hidden after the murder, and who understood what was inside. The empty suitcase speaks. Miss Marple gestured to the case. When the police first found this, it was empty, apparently useless. But it had once contained something very important, the original parish records, missing for decades. Records that proved Reverend Carston had been preparing to expose corruption in the parish fund. That discovery would have ruined certain reputations, perhaps even destroyed families. She paused. But when the suitcase was found, those papers were gone. Graves nodded slowly. "So the murderer took them." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "And then burned them, not to protect Harcourt, but to protect themselves." Her eyes shifted toward Clara Dane. "Isn't that so, my dear?" Clara froze, color draining from her face. I don't understand." "Oh, but you do," said Miss Marple softly. "Your mother discovered what Harcourt was planning. She begged him to stop. But when he refused, you followed her to the inn that night. You meant to frighten him, to make him destroy the papers yourself. You struck him, thinking only to silence him for a moment. But he fell. And then you panicked." A shudder went through Clara's body. "It was an accident," she whispered. "I swear it was. He fell against the table. I didn't mean to." Tears filled her eyes. Mother said she'd take the blame if it ever came out. She said some things were better left buried. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "She loved you very much, my dear. Enough to protect you, even in death." Graves sighed heavily. "You realize, Miss Dane, that you'll have to make a full statement." Clara nodded weakly. "I know. It's what Mother would want." Justice in silence. When they had gone, and the house grew quiet once more, Miss Marple remained seated by the fire. Inspector Graves lingered beside her, shaking his head. "You amaze me, Miss Marple. All this from an old suitcase." She smiled faintly. "It's never the object, Inspector. It's what people believe it contains. Greed, fear, guilt. They all fit neatly inside, until someone dares to open it." He chuckled softly. "You've a way of finding truth even when it tries to hide under 70 years of dust." "Oh, no," she said, sipping her now cold tea. "I simply listen. People always tell you what you need to know, if you're patient enough to hear it." The village at dusk. As evening fell, the village of Rosehill seemed to exhale at last. The air was clean again, the shadows gentle rather than menacing. From her garden gate, Miss Marple watched the lamplighter make his rounds, the golden glow of each lamp flickering to life in turn. She looked toward the river, toward the bridge beneath which so many secrets had slept, and smiled faintly. "Poor Mrs. Dane," she whispered. "She wanted peace, not justice. But perhaps, in the end, she has both." The suitcase rested by her side, still empty, yet no longer hollow. It had carried the weight of guilt and silence for too long. Now, at last, it was only leather and air again. And for Miss Marple, that was more than enough.